A single drink was banned by governments, condemned by priests, blamed for political radicalism, and nearly destroyed by royal decree. Not once, not twice, but repeatedly across 3 continents over 500 years. And yet, every morning, roughly 2 billion people wake up and make it anyway, often before they are coherent enough to form a sentence. That drink is coffee. Not the beige, sugary, vaguely coffee-flavored beverage you get at a drive-thru at 7 in the morning. Though no judgment, but coffee. The real thing. The drink that quietly, persistently, and almost accidentally changed the course of human history. The origin: Ethiopia and the goat herder. In the highlands of what is now Ethiopia, somewhere around the 9th century, there was a goat herder named Kaldi. And look, we need to talk about Kaldi for a second, because his story is one of those origin legends that historians debate endlessly, and yet nobody actually wants to get rid of it because it is too good. According to the legend, Kaldi noticed that his goats were behaving strangely. Not just a little strange. We are talking goats that were leaping around the hillside in the middle of the night, refusing to sleep, full of an energy that made absolutely no sense. Kaldi, being a curious person, rather than a person who simply accepted that his goats had lost their minds, started watching them. He traced their behavior back to a particular tree. A wild tree with glossy dark leaves and small, bright red berries growing in clusters across the branches. The goats were eating the berries. The berries were doing something remarkable to them. The region was called Kaffa, and wild coffee trees had been growing there for thousands of years before any human being ever thought to do anything deliberate with them. The Kaffa highlands, sitting at elevations between 4,000 and 6,000 feet, with their rich volcanic soil, consistent rainfall, and cool mountain temperatures, were essentially the perfect natural greenhouse for Coffea arabica, the plant species that would eventually caffeinate the entire human race. Early consumption of coffee in Ethiopia had nothing to do with brewing. Nobody was grinding beans. Nobody was pulling espresso shots. The indigenous peoples of the region would crush the coffee cherries, mix them with animal fat, and roll them into small balls that could be carried and eaten on long journeys. It was, in a very real sense, the world's first energy bar. Slightly less convenient than a modern granola bar, but significantly more interesting historically. The other group who discovered what coffee could do were monks. Ethiopian monks and priests had a problem that will feel familiar to anyone who has ever had to stay awake through something they would rather not be awake for. Long, hours-long prayer sessions in the middle of the night were a genuine spiritual obligation, and the human body's stubborn insistence on needing sleep was not considered a valid excuse. Someone, at some point, figured out that consuming these berries, or brewing a rough tea from the leaves and husks, made staying awake considerably easier. Whether this was a divine miracle or just good pharmacology probably depended on who you asked. Yemen and the birth of coffee culture. The story of coffee becoming an actual drink, the kind you brew and consume in a cup, begins not in Ethiopia but across the Red Sea, in Yemen, sometime in the 15th century. Sufi monks in the Yemeni port city of Mocha were the first people to cultivate coffee deliberately, to roast the beans, grind them, and brew them into something resembling what we would recognize today. They called it kahwa, which originally referred to wine, which tells you something about how seriously they took it. The Sufis drank coffee during their nighttime religious ceremonies, using it precisely for the same reason the Ethiopian monks had: to stay awake, to maintain focus, to push through the physical demand of long hours of prayer and devotion. But kahwa spread beyond the monasteries faster than anyone expected, because it turns out that if you give people a beverage that makes them feel alert, sociable, and mentally sharp, they do not tend to keep it confined to religious practice for very long. Yemen held a monopoly on coffee production for over a century and a half, and they protected it with the kind of seriousness usually reserved for military secrets. All coffee exported from Yemen was processed first. Beans were boiled or partially roasted before leaving the country, specifically to prevent anyone from planting them elsewhere and growing their own supply. The port city of Mocha became so synonymous with the coffee trade that the word mocha entered the language as a descriptor for coffee itself. So yes, the next time you order a mocha at a coffee shop, you are invoking a 15th century Yemeni port city. You are welcome for that context. From Yemen, coffee moved through the Ottoman Empire with remarkable speed. By the early 1500s, it had reached Mecca, Medina, Cairo, and Constantinople. And wherever it went, it spawned something that had never quite existed before in the world: the coffee house. The Ottoman coffee house. A radical idea. The first coffee houses in Constantinople opened around 1555, and almost immediately, the authorities were nervous. To understand why, you have to understand what a coffee house actually was, because it was not just a place to buy a hot drink. A coffee house was a place where any man, regardless of his social rank or profession, could walk in, pay a small amount of money for a cup of coffee, sit down, and talk to other men. About anything. About politics. About religion. About the Sultan's latest decision. About whether the grain prices were fair or whether the governor was corrupt, or whether the war in the East was going well or badly. This sounds unremarkable now, in a world where you can say whatever you want on the internet at 2 in the morning in your pajamas. But in the 16th century Ottoman Empire, there was essentially no other space where this kind of open, public, cross-class conversation could happen. The mosque was for prayer. The palace was for the powerful. The home was private. The coffee house was something entirely new. It was public space organized around conversation. And conversation, as governments throughout history have consistently understood, is dangerous. The coffee houses were called kahvehane, and they filled up with poets, philosophers, merchants, soldiers, government officials, and ordinary working men. All of them sitting together, all of them talking. People played chess and backgammon. Storytellers performed. Musicians played. And underneath all of it, ideas circulated in a way that had never been possible before. Sultan Murad IV banned coffee and coffee houses in 1623. He was so serious about this that the punishment for a first offense was beating. A second offense could get you sewn into a leather bag and thrown into the Bosphorus, which, to be clear, is an extraordinarily severe response to a beverage. But Murad was not stupid. He understood that the coffee houses were not really about the coffee. They were about what happened when people drank it together, in public, without supervision. The bans did not work. They never worked. The coffee houses kept reopening. The people kept coming back. And eventually, even the most authoritarian Ottoman sultans had to accept that you cannot unseat an idea once it has found a comfortable chair and a warm cup to hold. Coffee reaches Europe, and Europe panics. Coffee arrived in Europe in the early 1600s, carried by Venetian merchants who had encountered it through their extensive trade networks in the Ottoman world. And Europe, true to form, immediately panicked. The first response in many Catholic communities was theological suspicion. Coffee was a Muslim drink. It came from the Islamic world. It was associated with Sufi religious practice, and some clergymen argued that allowing Christians to drink it would be a kind of spiritual contamination. A group of priests in Venice formally petitioned Pope Clement VIII to ban coffee entirely on these grounds. The Pope, to his eternal credit, and to the considerable relief of everyone reading this, decided to try it first before making any decisions. He tasted it, reportedly enjoyed it a great deal, and declared that it would be a shame to let the Muslims have exclusive enjoyment of this drink. He blessed it instead. The Vatican had just given coffee its theological clearance, and Europe was never the same. By the 1650s, London had its first coffee house. By 1660, there were over 300 of them in the city. By 1700, Estimates suggest there were more than 2,000 coffeehouses operating in London alone. And what happened inside them followed the same pattern that had alarmed the Ottoman sultans decades earlier. People talked, but in London, the conversations had a specific flavor. Merchants discussed trade. Lawyers debated cases. Scientists argued theories. Journalists gathered information. Each coffeehouse developed its own clientele and its own character. Poets went to Will's coffeehouse. Scientists gathered at the Grecian. Merchants involved in shipping met at Lloyd's. The admission price was 1 penny, which bought you a cup of coffee and access to every conversation happening in the room, every newspaper left on the tables, and every piece of commercial intelligence being quietly exchanged in the corners. People called them penny universities, and that was not a compliment being paid lightly. The idea was that for the price of a penny, any literate working man could walk in and receive an education in the practical affairs of the world that no formal institution could match. King Charles II looked at this situation in 1675 and arrived at exactly the same conclusion as Sultan Murad had 50 years earlier. He issued a royal proclamation banning coffeehouses on the grounds that they were places where people spread malicious and scandalous reports against the government. He gave them 11 days to close. The public response was so immediate and so furious that the king reversed the proclamation within days. Not weeks. Days. Coffee had beaten the king, and it had not even had to raise its voice. Coffee and the birth of modern finance. Here is the part of coffee's history that almost nobody learns in school, and it is genuinely extraordinary. Some of the most important financial institutions in the modern world did not begin in banks or trading halls or government buildings. They began in coffeehouses. Lloyd's of London, which is today one of the most powerful insurance markets on the planet, insuring everything from oil rigs to celebrity body parts, began as a coffeehouse. Edward Lloyd opened his establishment on Tower Street in London in 1688. It became popular with sailors, merchants, and ship owners because Lloyd made a point of keeping good shipping intelligence, including lists of vessels, their routes, their cargoes, and their owners. Merchants who needed to insure their ships against loss started gathering there to find other men willing to underwrite the risk. The coffeehouse became a marketplace for marine insurance. That coffeehouse eventually became Lloyd's of London. The building is different. The coffee is gone. The institution remains. Jonathan's Coffeehouse in Exchange Alley became the meeting place for stockbrokers and traders who had been thrown out of the Royal Exchange for being too loud and too disruptive. Which, if you have ever watched financial traders at work, makes complete sense. They formalized their trading practices inside Jonathan's, developed rules, established prices, and eventually transformed that coffeehouse into what became the London Stock Exchange. Think about that for a moment. Two of the foundational institutions of modern global capitalism, insurance and stock trading, were invented by men sitting in coffeehouses, drinking coffee, talking. Caffeine and conversation did not just fuel the Enlightenment. They built the architecture of modern finance. The Boston Tea Party and coffee's rise in America. By the time coffee reached the American colonies in the mid-1600s, it was already competing with tea, which the British East India Company had been actively promoting for decades. For a while, tea was winning. Colonial Americans drank tea the way the British did, habitually, socially, and in large quantities. And then, on the night of December 16, 1773, a group of colonists boarded 3 ships in Boston Harbor and threw 342 chests of British tea into the water. The Boston Tea Party is usually taught as a protest against taxation without representation, and it was. But its cultural consequences were just as significant as its political ones. Drinking tea after the Boston Tea Party became, almost overnight, an act of loyalty to the British Crown. Patriots needed an alternative. Coffee was right there. The shift was not just symbolic. It was deliberate. The Continental Congress in 1774 formally encouraged Americans to abandon tea in favor of coffee as an act of political resistance. Coffeehouses in Philadelphia, New York, and Boston became the gathering places where revolutionary ideas were shared, debated, and turned into plans. The Merchants Coffee House in New York hosted some of the earliest discussions about what an independent American government might actually look like. Thomas Jefferson, who had a tendency to be enthusiastic about things he enjoyed, called coffee the favorite drink of the civilized world. He was drinking it daily at Monticello. John Adams switched to coffee after the Tea Party and kept the habit for the rest of his life, reportedly telling his wife that he was making the sacrifice for the good of the nation. Sure, John. Whatever helps. America never went back to tea. Today, Americans drink over 400 million cups of coffee every single day. The Boston Tea Party did not just help start a revolution. It accidentally created the largest coffee-consuming nation in the Western world. The French Revolution and the Café de Foy. While Americans were turning coffee into patriotism, the French were turning it into something even more volatile. Revolution. Paris in the 1780s was a city stretched to its breaking point. The harvests had failed. Bread was unaffordable. The gap between the aristocracy and everyone else was so obscene that it had stopped being a social problem and become a philosophical one. And in the middle of all of this, the cafes of Paris were running at full capacity. The Café de Procope, opened in 1686 on the left bank, was the oldest coffeehouse in Paris and arguably the most important room in Enlightenment Europe. Voltaire reportedly drank 40 cups of coffee a day there, which, first of all, is an absolutely heroic and slightly alarming quantity, and second of all, possibly explains the productivity. Jean-Jacques Rousseau wrote there. Denis Diderot compiled sections of the Encyclopédie there. Benjamin Franklin, who was in Paris negotiating French support for the American Revolution, drank coffee there. Robespierre, the man who would eventually send hundreds of people to the guillotine in the name of Republican virtue, was a regular. The ideas that broke the French monarchy were not hatched in palaces or universities. They were written on café tables with coffee-stained manuscripts. But the single most consequential cup of coffee in French history may have been the one served at the Café de Foy on the afternoon of July 12, 1789. A journalist and political agitator named Camille Desmoulins jumped onto a table inside the café, drew a pistol, and delivered a furious speech to the crowd gathered around him. He told them that the king's troops were coming, that a massacre of the patriots was imminent, that the time had come. He grabbed leaves from the trees outside and passed them out as makeshift cockades. The crowd spilled out of the café and into the streets. 2 days later, they stormed the Bastille. The French Revolution did not begin in a palace or a parliament. It began in a coffee house. A man stood on a table, made a speech, and history turned. The global scramble. Colonialism and coffee. While Europe was busy using coffee to overthrow governments, a quieter but equally consequential drama was playing out in the realm of agriculture and empire. For over a century and a half, Yemen had maintained its monopoly on coffee production with remarkable effectiveness. But monopolies, like governments that ban coffee, have a habit of eventually failing. The Dutch were the ones who broke it. In 1616, Dutch traders managed to obtain a live coffee plant, exactly how remains somewhat diplomatically vague in the historical record, but the word stolen appears in several accounts with very little ambiguity. They brought it to the Amsterdam Botanical Garden, cultivated it, studied it, and then sent seedlings to their colonial territories in Asia. The island of Java, in what is now Indonesia, turned out to have exactly the right climate and soil for coffee cultivation. Dutch-run coffee plantations in Java began producing at scale by the early 1700s, and within a few decades, the word Java had entered the English language as a synonym for coffee itself. The French got their hands on a coffee plant next, through a story that reads like a diplomatic heist. A single coffee seedling was brought to the Paris Botanical Garden in 1714 as a gift from the Dutch. In 1723, a young French naval officer named Gabriel de Clieur requested a cutting from that plant to take to the French colony of Martinique in the Caribbean. The request was eventually approved, though apparently not without considerable bureaucratic resistance. De Clieur made the crossing under genuinely difficult conditions. The ship was attacked by pirates. There was a storm. Fresh water ran desperately short, and de Clieur, by his own account, shared his personal water ration with the coffee plant for weeks to keep it alive. He arrived in Martinique with one surviving seedling. That one plant, according to historical estimates, became the ancestor of the vast majority of coffee plants across Central America, South America, and the Caribbean. The French colonial coffee industry in Martinique, Haiti, and Guadeloupe exploded. And when the Dutch and French were scrambling for their share, the Portuguese were quietly doing the same in Brazil. Brazil today produces roughly 1/3 of all the coffee consumed on Earth. It is the largest coffee producer in the world by an enormous margin, and has been for over a century and a half. But the Brazilian coffee industry, like the Caribbean plantations before it, was built on enslaved labor. The expansion of coffee cultivation into the Brazilian interior during the 18th and 19th centuries drove one of the largest forced migrations in history. Millions of enslaved Africans worked the coffee fazendas under conditions that echoed the brutality of the Caribbean sugar plantations. The coffee in European cups and American cups and cups across the entire world was being produced at a human cost that the people drinking it rarely had to think about, and were generally not encouraged to. The abolition of slavery in Brazil did not come until 1888, making it the last country in the Western Hemisphere to end the practice. The coffee industry had fought abolition at every turn. The same crop that had filled the coffeehouses where Enlightenment thinkers debated the rights of man was being harvested by people who had none. The science of coffee. What it actually does. Since we are already this deep into the history of coffee, it seems only fair to briefly explain what it is actually doing to your body, because the science is genuinely interesting and slightly strange. Coffee works because of a molecule called caffeine, and caffeine works by being an extraordinarily good imposter. Your brain uses a chemical called adenosine to track how long you have been awake. As the day goes on, adenosine builds up, binds to receptors in your brain, and makes you feel increasingly tired. It is your body's built-in sleep pressure system, and under normal circumstances it works beautifully. Caffeine's molecular structure is similar enough to adenosine that it fits into those same receptors and blocks them. The adenosine is still building up, but it cannot deliver its message. You do not feel tired because your brain's tiredness signal is being actively intercepted. Eventually, when the caffeine wears off and clears out of those receptors, all the adenosine that has been accumulating rushes in at once, which is why the caffeine crash feels so sudden and so dramatically unfair. Coffee also, and this is the part that feels slightly awkward to mention in a historical documentary, but here we are, stimulates the muscles of the colon, which is why a significant portion of coffee drinkers experience a very specific and very urgent need approximately 20 minutes after their morning cup. This has been studied. It is real. It is called the gastrocolic reflex. And the fact that this particular side effect has never once discouraged anyone from drinking coffee is perhaps the most powerful testament to how good coffee actually makes people feel. The modern coffee world. The coffee industry, as most people experience it today, was largely shaped by three distinct phases that coffee historians actually call waves, which is a slightly dramatic way to describe changes in how people purchase hot beverages, but let us go with it. The first wave of coffee was essentially the industrialization of the drink. From the late 1800s through most of the 20th century, the goal was to make coffee cheap, consistent, and available everywhere. Maxwell House, Folgers, and instant coffee defined this era. The coffee was not particularly good. Nobody especially cared. The point was the caffeine and the ritual, not the flavor. Instant coffee, invented in a commercially viable form by a Japanese-American chemist named Satoru Kato in 1903, and later popularized during both World Wars when it was included in military rations, became the most democratic form of coffee the world had ever seen. Just add hot water. Done. 2 billion cups a day. The second wave arrived in the 1970s and 80s, and its defining institution was a coffee company from Seattle that you have almost certainly heard of. Starbucks, founded in 1971 as a single store selling coffee beans in Pike Place Market, transformed into something else entirely under the leadership of Howard Schultz in the 1980s. Schultz visited Italy in 1983, walked into an espresso bar in Milan, and had what he described as a revelation. He wanted to bring that experience, the craft, the ritual, the sense of place, to America. What he actually built was something more complicated. Starbucks made espresso drinks accessible to tens of millions of people who had never tasted them. It also made the coffee house a mainstream social destination again for the first time since the 18th century. By 2023, Starbucks had over 35,000 locations in 80 countries. The Ottoman Sultan who tried to ban the coffee house would be furious. The third wave, which is still happening, is a reaction against the second. Small, independent roasters started appearing in the 1990s and 2000s, obsessing over the origin of their beans, the altitude at which they were grown, the variety of the plant, the method of processing, the temperature of the water, the grind size. Talking to a dedicated third-wave coffee professional about their product can feel like being lectured by someone who has recently discovered a religion. Lovingly, respectfully, but still a lecture. These roasters have, however, done something genuinely important. They brought the conversation about coffee quality back to the farmers growing the beans, many of them in Ethiopia, in Colombia, in Guatemala, in Yemen, in places where coffee's story began thousands of years ago. Ethiopia, where Chaldees goats first danced around a coffee tree sometime in the 9th century, is still producing some of the finest coffee on earth. The Yirgacheffe region, the Sidama region, the Harar region. These names appear on the menus of specialty coffee shops from London to Tokyo to New York. The country that gave the world coffee is still, in the 21st century, one of its most celebrated producers. There is something deeply satisfying about that. Today, coffee is the second most traded commodity on earth after oil. Over 10 million tons of coffee are produced every year across more than 70 countries. Brazil alone accounts for roughly 35% of global production. Colombia, Vietnam, Indonesia, and Ethiopia follow. Over 2 billion cups are consumed every single day by people on every continent, in every culture, in every economic circumstance. It is drunk from glass demi-tasse cups in Turkish cafes and from paper cups in American gas stations and from small clay pots in Ethiopian ceremonies that have changed very little in centuries. The same plant, the same molecule, wildly different rituals. So here is where we have arrived after 10 centuries of history. A wild tree on an Ethiopian hillside, noticed by a goat herder whose goats refused to sleep. Carried across the Red Sea to Yemen, where Sufi mystics turned it into a drink. Spreading through the Ottoman Empire, where it created the world's first democratic public spaces and gave authoritarian sultans enough anxiety to attempt multiple bans. Crossing into Europe, where it unseated a king's proclamation in less than a week, gave capitalism two of its foundational institutions, and filled the rooms where the Enlightenment was born. Crossing the Atlantic, where it helped fuel two revolutions, one American, one French, and permanently altered the dietary habits of an entire nation. Spreading across the tropics through colonial violence and botanical theft, building enormous wealth for empires while destroying the lives of the people forced to grow it. And arriving, finally, at this particular moment in history, where it is the first thing 2 billion people reach for every morning before they are ready to face whatever the day intends to do to them. The coffee house that King Charles II tried to close in 1675 is still, in spirit, open. Every cafe where someone sits with a laptop and a cappuccino, half working and half eavesdropping on the conversation at the next table, is a direct descendant of the penny universities of London and the Cave Khane of Constantinople. Every morning, ritual with a cup is connected to an Ethiopian monk trying to stay awake for prayer and a Yemeni trader guarding his precious beans at the port of Mocha. Coffee never just woke people up. It woke them up and then gave them somewhere to go and something to say. It created the spaces where the modern world was argued into existence, one cup at a time. Not bad for a goat's dietary choice on a hillside in Africa. If this story surprised you, hit subscribe and drop a comment telling us which part of coffee's history you had absolutely no idea about. And if you are watching this with a cup in your hand right now, which statistically some of you are, take a second to appreciate just how much history you are holding.